Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem with breaking news from All Israel News here in Israel. It's an extraordinary day unfolding here, and I've brought in to discuss events that are unfolding right now at this hour. Again, a very fast-moving story. Calev Myers, he is a prominent Christian attorney. He's Israeli. He served in the army. He's a partner with one of the top law firms here in Israel. He's also the founder of Jerusalem Institute of Justice, which is the main nonprofit legal firm organization that defends believers in civil rights issues. And so he's got broad perspective. He represents the vast majority of Christian ministries here in the land, but also he has led the legal fights at the Supreme Court on numerous occasions and won on numerous occasions. So to talk about what's happening with judicial reform, I thought this is Calev Myers is the exact right guy. Calev, thank you for joining us on All Israel News.
Yeah, it's an honor to be with you, Joel.
Things are moving very, very fast. Why don't you start with how you see just the last 24, 48 hours, not analytically, but just why don't you just tick through some of the headlines that we're seeing that we have to bring everyone up to speed on?
I think, the kind of the biggest thing that happened that on the wave of these massive demonstrations that we've seen in the streets, we've been having up to 500,000 people in the streets every week now, every weekend in Israel, which is a lot for a small country of 9 million people. This is a massive amount of people being out on the streets. But what caused the big eruption again last night was the fact that our Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu fired our Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, simply because he came out and said, we are dealing with a serious defense issue. The security of our state could be compromised. The reason for that is that so many volunteer reserve duty units and officers, including our fighter pilots and people in very, very important intelligent units, our foot soldiers and infantry, have come and said if this big legal form goes through to the extent that's being presented right now, that will be such a disaster to our democracy that we won't be able to serve anymore on a volunteer basis for the IDF. And we're talking about thousands of soldiers. So our Minister of Defense came out and said we need to stop the train of legislation right now. Just put on the brakes and try to negotiate with the opposition, opposition leaders in the Knesset in order to come up with a legal reform that has a much broader consensus. Otherwise, we're running into very dangerous waters for our security. And our Prime Minister responded to that by firing from his position. This caused even a greater eruption as people took to the streets last night and today. They've declared now a general strike across Israel. All the government offices are going on strike.
The airport is shut down.
All flights coming in and out of the airport
shut down. The only time I can ever remember Ben Gurion being shut down was in the recent rocket wars with Gaza, in which rockets were being fired so close to the airport. And even with the Iron Dome, they thought just for a few hours to try to make sure we have enough Iron Dome systems nearby. In the past, even in wartime, keeping Ben Gurion International Airport open was one of the signs of national pride. And now literally flights are not coming in or out because people have said, no, I won't work there.
That's right. And also even the municipalities. So that's very interesting that all of the coalition of mayors, there's a national coalition of mayors. They said we're shutting down and striking all the municipalities. That's very interesting because the head of the coalition of the national coalition of mayors in Israel is Chaim Bibas, who is a very strong leader within the Likud party. This is Netanyahu's party. So this constitutes a very interesting development vis-a-vis the internal political situation that Bibi is dealing with right now.
Yeah, I'll add you more. That's a great summary. I wish that was all Dayenu, like that, if this alone was enough, but several other things. All the malls are being shut down here. Kindergartens are being shut down here. Again, it's a reaction to strikes. Now, to be clear, many of the people that were initially protesting, and certainly the core of the protest movement, are people who hate Benjamin Netanyahu anyway. We need to stipulate that that's the core. But what's happened is clearly growing far beyond just people who voted against Netanyahu, wanted, Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz or somebody on the, who are currently in the opposition. This is going beyond that. And I think your point about the defense minister is important. Why? Because Yoav Gallant, who was our defense minister until a few hours ago, is a senior Likud member, a loyal ally of Bibi Netanyahu. These are not political enemies who just happen to be sort of, bringing out into the open a long simmering fight between them. Netanyahu never would have appointed him in this new government to be in charge of defense, which means for Netanyahu being in charge of the attack on Iran when and if it has to happen. He's just pulled him out. That has multiple implications. One, it has the implication that Gallant is the guy who for the last several months have been going to the United States, going to Europe, meeting with all of our defense allies, getting ready for, look, if we have to go to war to stop Iran, let's be in close coordination. So he's Bibi's top guy on Bibi's top priority, which is Iran. So this is a huge development.
You mentioned, by the way, the kindergartens. Actually, the whole education system is shut down. That would include kindergartens, primary schools, high schools, and universities and colleges are all completely shut down. Israel is going into a general massive strike. And one of the things you mentioned,
So economically, you've got now port traffic for an export-based country, export-based economy. This is a huge development.
It's huge. And you mentioned the looming threat of Iran and a potential necessary preemptive strike because they're getting close to nuclear capability. This is something that all the people that are out on the street are very cognizant of. It's not that the Israelis are not concerned about this, but what this demonstration is saying is that our internal issues and the nature and integrity of our democracy is seen to us as more of a threat than the Iranian threat right now. And I think that's a very interesting statement that we need to look at.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to be clear. Gallant is not saying he's against the judicial reform proposal in total. What he's saying is, what he said was essentially, let's take off until after Passover. Let's just slow it down. Let's have a conversation. Let people be able to enjoy the high holiday. Well, it's not the high holidays, but Passover, and for Christians for Easter, and of course Muslims for Ramadan. It's a highly tense, highly combustible month anyway here in Israel, which the security services were already concerned about Palestinian provocations, not about internal Israeli provocations. Right. So, and practically speaking, let's just be clear. That really means there's only about a week that Gallant was asking that the Knesset stop considering. Why? Because the next, I think, 3 weeks or so, the Knesset is out of session anyway. So you're really just saying, let's take the week right now off. Let's let everybody cool down. Let's keep thinking. Let's keep discussing. And for Netanyahu, he considered that an act of insubordination, apparently. Yes. He's supposed to address the country, and that was supposed to be at 10:30 this morning Israel time, which would be 3:30 in the morning East Coast time. That has been delayed. It's been delayed for the main reason is Netanyahu is meeting, as you and I are taping this, with all the heads of the factions.
Yeah, I understand that it was delayed, particularly because Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the head of the, I would say the radical right-wing religious party, he said if you stop the legislation now, then we might leave the government. And so this becomes a political survival issue for Netanyahu. Certainly, there's survival of this government, and if Netanyahu cannot survive in leadership with this government, he probably doesn't have any other formula of maintaining a position as prime minister. So he really has his back to the wall now, as these other coalition leaders are threatening to leave the coalition if he doesn't stop the legislation. The only other thing that could happen is if Benny Gantz would be willing to swallow his ego and his pride again and step back into a government with Bibi Netanyahu. He definitely got burnt the last time he tried that. But if he would be willing to do that, to create a national unity government with the center left together with Likud and the religious parties, that could salvage this situation. And then these legal reforms could possibly go through with a much broader consensus. But whether or not Gantz will be willing to do that, I'm not sure. Whether he wants to be, the life-saving ref for Bibi in a situation like that is a very good question.
It is a very good question. And let me, just in the few minutes that we have, pick up on that for a moment. Again, I want to point out again to our viewers, our readers, that the defense minister who was just fired is not against the Netanyahu proposals. Now, he may have, there are indications he thinks that there are some tweaks that could be made, some compromises that could be made, but what he was asking for was a pause so that the security services could sort of reassess and figure out how to handle this without it just being, sort of ramrodded through the Knesset. So that's number one. Second, other members within Likud are indicating that there are at least 5 members, and there may be more, who are saying, look, we're for the basic direction of the reforms, but there are areas that we disagree with. One of those areas, and you and I, Calev, have discussed this recently as speaking to business leaders in recent days who are here visiting, evangelical business leaders, is the issue of this override clause that
right.
if only 61 seats, meaning a bare majority, literally one seat making it a majority in the Knesset, could override a Supreme Court decision to strike down a law that they felt was not appropriate in the Israeli system, what Americans would call unconstitutional, though we don't have a constitution, that the Israeli Knesset could just, with a very simple majority, override that. Well, that would effectively mean there is no Supreme Court, because any majority government, by definition, has 61 seats to pass almost anything that it wants. So that would mean a two-cameral system, meaning only 2 branches, legislative, but the government is part of the legislative and dominates the legislative and the Supreme Court. Now there would only be the legislative government. So that's where people fear, whoa, that is basically erasing democracy. There's no check, there's no balance on the government, on the legislature, if the Supreme Court is emasculated. And I think there is this growing sense. I share it. I'm for the reforms the way they're mostly going. There's some minor nuances that it could work this way, it could work. But that override to me is a fundamental threat.
So let's talk about, I think we could talk about the override clause and what's the thinking behind it and why it's so important to this coalition. What you see is each of the the partners within this coalition has a different aspect of this legal reform is important to them. In the Likud ranks, by the way, almost only thing they talk about is the appointment of judges, because they felt like for many years there weren't enough Sephardic Jews or other minorities within Israel. You have a Supreme Court a panel that looks mostly like European Ashkenazi Jews from a certain sector of society that perpetuate themselves in the Judiciary Appointment Committee, which is made up of a majority of judges and lawyers. And so this is the thing that's most important to them, and maybe also even to Itamar Ben-Gvir and his party. They really care about this. This is what they put forward first, and they want to pass this. They're pushing to pass this before Passover. The faction of the party that cares most about the override clause is actually the ultra-religious Haredi party. Why? Because for 3 times in Israel's history, they tried to put forward a law which would make the situation legal that if you are a full-time yeshiva student, an ultra-religious student studying Torah, you get a blanket exemption from IDF service. This is
which nobody else gets.
That's right. So it's actually been passed through Knesset 3 times, gone up to the Supreme Court 3 times. Supreme Court says this is unconstitutional. Again, we don't exactly have a constitution, we have basic laws, but because it breaches the principle of equality within our system, and they want the override clause at any cost in order to finally get approval of their blanket exemption from the military. Now, one of the things that our president said recently in the compromise was, well, why don't we bump up the requisite supermajority for an override clause, let's say to 70 members of Knesset. But as part of the reform, we will all agree that the Haredim, that the ultra-religious, still get this exemption from the army, so they kind of takes away the pressure of creating the 61 voice,
which, by the way, I disagree with, but I see Herzog trying to, Isaac Herzog is our president, and the president doesn't have legislative power, just for our viewers who are not familiar. But in a sense, Herzog is very highly respected, and he is saying, let's slow this thing down so we can discuss. And he offered a compromise that almost everybody disagreed with, but someone like Natan Sharansky, who's a Jewish hero and has been a longtime Netanyahu, very close ally, used to be the head of the Jewish agency, has said, I disagree with the specifics, but the direction that Herzog wants to go, I agree with. Let's just take a moment and talk about it.
But I think if you zoom out, Joel, and really try to understand what's happening right now in Israel, if you kind of look historically, the right has won on most issues. I think most people would say 80% of the Israeli public agrees on most policy. On economic issues, most of the Israeli public are free market capitalists. On kind of security issues vis-a-vis the Palestinians, you don't really have a peace camp anymore that's saying, we want a Palestinian state today. They're more saying, well, we don't really have a partner right now, so we need to manage the conflict in the best way possible. So basically, the right-wing policy has the upper hand on almost every issue right now. And then the question is, so what are we going to argue over now?
And not just the upper hand, like not just tactically, it's national consensus that is built and settled.
There's a broad consensus. And if you really look at the difference between, the actual platform of Likud compared to the center left, Yesh Atid or Machaneh Mamlechti, it's very difficult to find any difference. So the big kind of, we in our political system, we have to fight over something, right? But I think the fight going forward is exactly what you're seeing now, which is the balance between religion and state in Israel. What does it mean to be a Jewish democratic state? Is that a conflict of terms? Do the religious and the religious leaderships have certain rights that that cannot be overridden by the Supreme Court because they come from deep Jewish tradition, or are we all subject to the same democratic rules? This is the battle that's raging right now in Israel. I don't think it's going to go away very soon. I think this is going to define political lines and moving forward over the next 5 to 10 years within our system.
I think that's very, very well put, Calev. And I know we've got to wrap, but I want to make 3 simple bullet points. They're not simple, but they're important to get on the record in this conversation. Number 1, Ben-Gvir's threat to blow up the government, to pull out. I think Netanyahu should call that bluff. Ben-Gvir wouldn't even be in politics if Netanyahu hadn't pulled him in. He has no chance to build a coalition with anybody else in this country, nor does Smotrich, if they're not with Netanyahu. So Netanyahu has to figure out, is he in charge of this coalition? Is he the prime minister, or is he just a minister? And there's a difference. And if anyone can do it, it's Netanyahu. He is more experienced than anybody in that chair. And this is a big test for him. So that's number 1. I would call the bluff. The second thing is what happened last week, in which 2 ultra-Orthodox party members introduced that legislation that All Israel News broke that story. We saw it. We reported it. It went viral. Everybody reported on it. That the bill would silence, would make it illegal, outlaw the ability to talk about Jesus, share the gospel, have a religious conversation with anybody, or you would go to prison. Now, Netanyahu moved very quickly, and I, to his great credit, to realize this was a threat to the Christian community, not just here, but all the Christians who love Israel, stand with Israel, who would turn on Israel at some level, not visit here, not invest here. And he moved quickly. But that shows the ultra-Orthodox want to impose their vision of religious law. It's maybe unfair, but I think people would understand. It's almost like a Jewish version of Sharia law, religious law. It's called halakha here. That is scary to me. I like the Jewish democratic state. This is where, look, you don't have to agree with each other, and even views that are unpopular, like some of mine, are still allowed. You don't go to prison for it. That's the second point. The third point is Benny Gantz, and let's just wrap with this. Talk about that a little bit more, because Gantz has indicated throughout his whole political career, after being a top IDF, chief of staff, that he puts Israel above all. Yeah. It's why he's bucked a lot of his colleagues and said, I'm willing to make a deal with Netanyahu on things for the sake of the country. And he has indicated he's willing to help on a compromise. I wonder, and I'd just like you to wrap in the final minute we have here, could Benny Gantz be a key player in where we go from here if there's a positive way forward?
Yes, the problem is the old adage that, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And Gantz already did this after saying in one of the, I think it was 2 elections ago, I will not go into a government with Netanyahu. But at the end of the day, it was either have a national unity government with Netanyahu or go to new elections. And Gantz said, I'm going to put the good of the Israeli people above my election promises. And he went into the government with Netanyahu, being promised to be, you know, the second prime minister in a rotation. And Netanyahu, you know, 6 months before Gantz would have become prime minister, he caused the system to fall apart by fighting over budgetary issues, etc. So Gantz never became prime minister. He felt like he was fooled by Bibi, and he said, this will never happen again. I cannot trust Bibi. So will Gantz again be willing to say, you know, regardless of my experience and, you know, what happened the last time, I'm again willing to put the best interests of Israel above my personal or political career? That's going to be a huge test of leadership.
It is
I don't know if it's possible.
I don't know either, but he has 12 seats. He could easily, well, not easily, but simply replace the religious parties. Maybe he doesn't get to be the prime minister, but he saves the country from this and gets a compromise of 70, 75 seats on the override or whatever. Look, we don't know. And throughout this day and the coming days, things are going to keep changing. Calev, thank you so much for your insight. I just ask everybody to be praying. Usually we're praying the peace of Jerusalem because of outside threats. Now we're praying for the peace of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Beersheba, from Dan to Beersheba. We need to be praying for peace within the society, and that we figure out, but that God shows mercy, figure out a way forward. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem. Calev Myers also in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. This is a breaking news update for All Israel News. Keep tuned to All Israel News, both on YouTube and on the main channel, allisrael.com, for continuing updates on these dramatic stories. God bless you.